Ever get the feeling that we're just scratching the surface? Like there's so much more going on underneath, especially when it comes to understanding the brain.
Oh, absolutely. It's like we're looking at the ripples on a pond, but not really seeing the current that's creating them.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And today we're going deep, diving into the world of ADHD and how it actually shows up in children's brains.
We've got some really fascinating research to unpack here. It's a study out of Aalto University and some other big research centers in Europe, recently published in PLOS One, and it's turning some heads.
Right. They used VR, virtual reality, in a totally new way to see brain activity that we've been kind of missing with our usual methods.
It's giving us a way more dynamic picture.
So for everyone listening, we're going to break down this research, figure out what it tells us about ADHD compared to like the old ways of looking at it, and even what it could mean for diagnosing and treating it in the future, maybe even without meds.
Okay, so, for a long time, the go-to for studying brain activity, especially with ADHD, has been fMRI scans, right? Functional magnetic resonance imaging. But the thing is, they've mostly been done while people are just resting.
Like just chilling in the scanner, not really doing anything specific.
Exactly, just kind of zoning out. And that's where this new study gets really interesting because what they found is that the brain differences linked to ADHD, in kids at least, they weren't really noticeable during these resting state scans.
So all this time, we might have been missing a big part of the picture because we were only looking at the brain when it was, I don't know, on idle.
Pretty much, like trying to understand how a car engine works by just looking at it when it's turned off. You need to see it running under load to really get what's going on.
Makes sense. So how do they actually go about studying the brain in a more active state? They use VR, you said, but it wasn't just any video game, right?
No, they got really creative with it. So imagine you're in an fMRI machine, which is already kind of a weird experience, right? It's this big tube, and you gotta lie still.
Yeah, not exactly the most stimulating environment.
Right, but then they project this VR game onto a mirror inside the scanner.
Oh, wow. So the kids could actually see and interact with this virtual world, even though they were stuck in the scanner.
Exactly. So it wasn't just passively watching something, they were actively doing things, moving around virtually, making decisions in the game.
That's pretty ingenious, to be honest. And the game itself wasn't just some random thing they threw together either.
Nope, it was carefully designed to test those core ADHD challenges, like memory and paying attention.
Yeah.
They even threw in these virtual toys that could be distracting.
Toys like what?
Like a virtual musical instrument they could play, a can of soda sitting in a fridge, even a shower they could turn on, things that might tempt them to, act impulsively.
Clever. It's like setting up a controlled environment where you can see how these ADHD tendencies might play out.
Exactly. And one of the lead researchers, Juha Salmisalaval, goes by Silmi. He says something really interesting about this whole approach.
I think I saw that quote, something about taking pictures of the brain.
Yeah, he said, taking pictures of the brain while memory and attention are being loaded in a virtual world gives us a deeper understanding of what's going on.
So it's not just about taking a snapshot of the brain, but seeing it in action, in a situation that's actually engaging and challenging.
That's the key. We're moving from static pictures to a full-on movie of how the brain works in real time, and it's really thinking and reacting.
Okay, so they've got the kids in the VR world, the fMRI is humming away. What do they actually see happening in the brains of those with ADHD while they were playing this game? What was different compared to the kids without ADHD?
So the big finding was that kids with ADHD showed these clear differences in how different parts of their brains were activating.
Meaning certain areas were lighting up more or less than in the other kids.
Kinda, but it was more than just that. These differences were really noticeable in the deeper parts of the brain and in how those areas were talking to the outer layer, the cortex.
So it's less about any one area being off and more about how well the different parts are working together, communicating with each other.
Exactly. It's like, imagine different departments in a company, right? If they can't communicate effectively, the whole operation falls apart. It's about teamwork, or what we call functional connectivity in the brain.
Makes sense. So in kids with ADHD, this study found that the communication between different brain regions wasn't quite as smooth, especially when they were actively engaged in the game.
Right. There was this interregional disruption, as they called it. And what's interesting is when they had the kids do something more passive, like just watching a video, the differences between the groups were way less obvious.
So again, it's all about seeing the brain in action under load to really understand how ADHD is affecting it.
Absolutely. It seems like those differences in how brain regions communicate really become apparent when someone with ADHD is trying to process information, make decisions, react to things, like they do in everyday life.
This is a pretty big deal, right? It's
Yeah.
like a fundamental shift in how we understand what's happening in the brains of people with ADHD. We used to think it was all about abnormal activity levels in certain areas, even at rest. How does this research change that picture?
Well, before, the idea was that even when someone with ADHD was just chilling, their brain was kind of firing differently in certain spots. But this research suggests it's more about how those different areas are coordinating, communicating with each other when the brain is actually working on something.
And that quote from Salmi really nails it, right? He said something like, alterations in brain activity are driven by the human-environment interaction.
Yeah, it's not just about the brain in isolation, it's about how it responds and adapts when it's actually interacting with the world around it, doing stuff.
Okay, so if these brain differences in ADHD really only show up during active tasks, what does that mean for how we diagnose it and for future research? We need to change things up, right?
For sure. The way we diagnose ADHD now, mostly relying on what people tell us about their behavior, even brain scans done at rest, it might be missing a huge piece of the puzzle.
Because we're not actually seeing how their brain works when it's under pressure, so to speak.
Exactly. Ideally, we should be looking at brain activity in situations where those core ADHD symptoms, the inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, are most likely to show up. So maybe we'll see diagnostic tools that involve these kinds of engaging tasks rather than just questionnaires and resting state scans.
That makes a ton of sense. You can't really test someone's ability to focus if you're only looking at their brain when there's nothing to focus on. And Salmi even talked about using these findings to develop new treatments, right? Maybe even ones that don't involve meds.
Yeah, he's hopeful about that. Imagine VR games specifically designed to train attention skills, and the difficulty level adjusts automatically based on the person's brain activity in real time.
That's a pretty cool idea, using tech to create more personalized and engaging therapies. And what about this other thing that's been in the news a lot? The fact that ADHD diagnoses seem to be going up. Could this research tell us anything about why that might be happening?
Possibly. Maybe by understanding how the brain works during active states, we can better tell the difference between real ADHD and other things that might look like it.
Okay, so maybe this research could help us get a handle on that whole issue.
Yeah, it's a complex issue for sure.
And there's another point they brought up that I found really interesting. It's about the effect of all this screen time we're all getting, with phones and games and social media.
Oh, right. Yeah, they were pretty upfront about that. They basically said that all the time we spend on things like TikTok and games, it could actually be changing how our brains work, even if we don't have ADHD.
And I remember that quote from Salmi where he talked about the brain being shaped by TikTok, Snapchat, and other apps and games.
Yeah, the brain is constantly adapting to its environment, right? So if our environment is constantly bombarding us with information and making us jump from one thing to another all the time, our brains might get really good at that rapid switching, but maybe not so good at focusing on one thing for a long time.
It's like our attention spans are getting, I don't know, fragmented.
Right. He even used this grasshopper brain analogy, like a grasshopper jumping from leaf to leaf. Maybe all this digital stimulation is training our brains to be more like grasshoppers.
That's a little unsettling when you think about it.
Definitely food for thought.
But that also makes this whole active brain scanning thing even more important, right?
Yeah.
Because it's not just about understanding ADHD, it's about understanding how all our brains are changing in this modern digital world.
Totally. By seeing the brain in action, we can learn so much about how it's being influenced by our environment, for better or worse.
So what's next for these researchers? What kind of studies are they planning to do next to build on what they've found so far?
Well, for kids, they're going to try using these smart suits with motion sensors to track their movements along with their brain activity. Getting even more detailed data about how they're behaving and thinking in different situations.
Like a high-tech version of those motion capture suits they use in movies.
Kind of. And for adults, they're working on creating even more realistic VR simulations, trying to make them as close to real life as possible.
To see how those more mature brains are responding to these complex, everyday challenges.
Exactly.
And they even mention the possibility of using things like augmented reality glasses to monitor symptoms at home in the future.
Yeah, imagine being able to track someone's attention and impulsivity subtly in their natural environment. It could really change how we understand and manage ADHD, making it way more personalized.
That would be amazing.
Yeah.
But for now, fMRI is still pretty expensive, right? not something most people can just access for a diagnosis.
Yeah, that's the reality. It's a powerful tool, but not widely available. The hope is that the knowledge we're getting from these studies will eventually lead to more affordable and accessible ways to diagnose and treat ADHD.
So before we wrap up, let's quickly remind everyone about the key details of this study. The lead researcher was Juha Salmitaival, or Salmi, from Aalto University.
And it was a big collaboration involving researchers from several institutions: HUS, University of Helsinki, University of Oulu in Finland, and the Lyon Neuroscience Research Center over in France.
And the VR game they used was called Epeli, developed by a Finnish company called Paley Vision.
Right, and the full study, if you're really interested, is called Real-World Goal-Directed Behavior Reveals Aberrant Functional Brain Connectivity in Children with ADHD, published in the journal PLOS1.
So for everyone listening, the main takeaway here is that to really understand something as complex as ADHD, we can't just look at the brain at rest, like it's some isolated thing. This research shows that we need to see it in action, engaged in real-world-like tasks to truly get a sense of what's going on. The traditional way, just looking at resting state scans, might be missing a lot of crucial information.
Absolutely. And this new understanding has some pretty big implications. It could lead to better ways of diagnosing ADHD, more accurate and dynamic, and maybe even to new treatments that are more engaging and don't rely solely on medication.
And on that note, here's something to chew on. If our brains are constantly adapting to our environments, especially in this digital age, how is all the time we spend in virtual worlds and on screens, how is that shaping our cognitive abilities, not just for people with ADHD, but for all of us? What other questions does this active approach to brain imaging raise about how our minds work in this increasingly digital world? Something to ponder for sure.
Definitely something to think about.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll catch you next time.
See you then.